The blood on Prudence Jenkins' hands had barely dried when another frantic knock came at her door, shattering what she hoped would be 2 hours of sleep after delivering the Morrison twins through the longest night of her 24 years. She pressed her forehead against the wash basin, watching crimson swirl in the water, her reflection gaunt and hollow-eyed in the lamplight of her small cabin on the edge of Palisade, Colorado. This frontier town, nestled in the western slopes valleys in the spring of 1885, seemed determined to populate itself faster than she could manage, and Prudence was the only midwife within 50 miles. "Miss Jenkins, please, it's my sister." The voice carried panic and exhaustion in equal measure. Prudence dried her trembling hands and opened the door to find Martha Cunningham, face flushed from running, dress soaked with creek water from where she'd stumbled in her haste. The woman's eyes held that familiar terror Prudence had seen too many times, the fear that death might steal away both mother and child before skilled hands could intervene. "How far along?" Prudence asked, already reaching for her medical bag without waiting for an invitation inside. "The pain started at dawn. She's been laboring 8 hours now and the baby won't come. Please, she's asking for you." Prudence wanted to weep. Her back ached from bending over the Morrison bed. Her fingers were raw from scrubbing. She had eaten nothing but hardtack and coffee in 36 hours. But she nodded, pulled her shawl around her shoulders, and followed Martha into the cool April morning where frost still clung to the sagebrush despite the promise of spring. The Cunningham homestead sat 3 miles outside town, and every step felt like walking through mud. Prudence's medical bag grew heavier with each passing minute. The sun climbed higher, warming the valley where the Colorado River ran swift with snowmelt, but she barely noticed the beauty of the awakening land. Her world had narrowed to placing one foot in front of the other, measuring her remaining strength against the task ahead. Inside the sod house, Sarah Cunningham writhed on a narrow bed, her screams raw and desperate. Prudence set down her bag and immediately went to work, checking the mother's progress with practiced efficiency. What she found made her stomach clench. The baby was breech, and Sarah was weakening fast. "Martha, I need hot water, clean linens, and whiskey. Now." Prudence stripped off her shawl and rolled up her sleeves, pushing aside her own exhaustion. A life depended on her, 2 lives, and she would not let them slip away no matter how badly her body begged for rest. The next 4 hours blurred into a nightmare of blood and tears and desperate prayers. Prudence's hands worked with a skill born of 5 years delivering babies in this harsh land, turning the infant with careful manipulation that made Sarah scream until her voice gave out. When the baby finally emerged silent and blue, Prudence's heart seized. She cleared the tiny mouth, rubbed the small chest, breathed gentle puffs of air into miniature lungs. "Come on," she thought. "Come on, little one. Fight." The baby's first cry was the sweetest sound she'd ever heard. By the time Prudence stumbled out of the Cunningham house, the sun was setting again, painting the western peaks in shades of amber and rose. Martha pressed coins into her palm, but Prudence barely felt them. She walked the 3 miles back to town in a daze, her bag lighter now that she'd left half her supplies behind, her body moving on pure instinct. She didn't see the rider until his horse nearly trampled her. "Whoa!" A man's voice, deep and alarmed, cut through her fog. Strong hands gripped her shoulders, steadying her as she swayed. "Madam, are you all right?" Prudence looked up into a face weathered by sun and wind, strong features framed by dark hair that needed cutting, and eyes so blue they reminded her of the Colorado sky at noon. The cowboy wore dusty trail clothes and the wary look of a man who'd been riding hard, but concern softened his expression as he studied her. "I'm fine," she managed, though her voice came out hoarse. "Just tired. You're the midwife." It wasn't a question. His hands remained on her shoulders as if he sensed she might collapse without the support. "Augustus Irving. I just hired on at the Double Creek Ranch, rode into town to collect the boss's supplies and heard folks talking about you being out at the Cunningham place. You've been up 2 days straight." Something like that. Prudence tried to step back to reclaim her independence, but her knees buckled. Augustus caught her before she hit the ground, his arms surprisingly gentle for a man who looked like he could wrestle steers. "Easy now. When did you last eat?" Prudence couldn't remember. "Yesterday. The day before." Time had lost meaning somewhere between the Morrison twins and little Sarah Cunningham's breech baby. Augustus made a decision. Without asking permission, he lifted Prudence into his saddle and swung up behind her. "Which way to your place?" she should have protested. Should have insisted she could walk. But the warmth of his chest against her back and the steady rhythm of the horse's gait made her eyes drift closed. She mumbled directions, and then there was nothing but darkness. Prudence woke in her own bed, fully clothed except for her boots, with late afternoon sunlight streaming through her window. For a moment she panicked, wondering what emergencies she'd missed. But then she saw the note on her bedside table written in rough, masculine script. "You slept 16 hours. I left food in your kitchen and tended your chickens. Had to get back to the ranch, but I'll check on you tomorrow. Augustus Irving." Prudence sat up slowly, taking inventory of her body. The bone-deep exhaustion had eased to mere tiredness. Her stomach growled fiercely, and she padded into the kitchen to find a pot of beef stew still warm on the back of her stove, fresh bread wrapped in cloth, and a crock of butter. Her chickens, visible through the window, scratched contentedly in their yard. A cowboy she'd never met had put her to bed, cooked for her, and cared for her livestock. The kindness of it brought tears to her eyes. In 5 years in Palisade, Prudence had delivered 63 babies, set broken bones, treated fevers and infections and injuries, and held the hands of dying men and women when their families couldn't bear to watch. She poured herself into this community until there was nothing left, and most days the only acknowledgement she received was the coins pressed into her palm and the fear in people's eyes when they needed her services. No one had ever simply taken care of her. Prudence ate the stew slowly, savoring each bite, and tried not to think too hard about the man with blue eyes who'd appeared like something out of a dream. True to his word, Augustus arrived the next afternoon just as Prudence was changing the dressing on old Walt Murphy's infected leg wound. The cowboy waited outside her cabin, leaning against the fence with his hat tipped back, watching her chickens with apparent fascination. When Walt hobbled out, Augustus tipped his hat politely and waited until the old man was out of earshot before approaching. "You look better," he said, those blue eyes taking in her appearance with an intensity that made her self-conscious. "Got some color back in your face." "Thank you for yesterday," Prudence said, wiping her hands on her apron. "For the food and everything, you didn't have to do that. Seemed like you needed it." Augustus shifted his weight, suddenly looking uncomfortable. "I was wondering if maybe I could take you to dinner at the hotel. They serve a decent roast on Friday nights." Prudence blinked. A dinner invitation. When was the last time someone had asked her to dinner? Not since before she'd left St. Louis to come west, back when she'd been young and foolish enough to think the frontier would be an adventure. "I don't know," she started, already forming an excuse, but Augustus held up a hand. "Before you say no, let me tell you something. I've been working ranches from Texas to Montana for 6 years now. I've seen all kinds of folks doing all kinds of work. But yesterday, watching you stumble back into town after saving 2 lives with your bare hands, looking like death yourself but still standing. That was the bravest thing I ever witnessed. You deserve one evening where somebody else does the taking care of. Just one evening. His words settled into the lonely places in her heart that Prudence had tried so hard to ignore. She was 24 years old, and she couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at her as anything other than the midwife, the healer, the woman you called when you were desperate. Augustus looked at her like she was a person worth knowing, worth courting. "All right," she heard herself say. Friday evening. His smile transformed his face, erasing years of hard living and revealing the genuinely good man beneath the weathered exterior. 6 o'clock. 6 o'clock. Prudence watched him ride away and wondered what she'd just agreed to. Dating her. The woman who smelled like blood and carbolic soap more often than not, whose hands were permanently stained from medicinal tinctures, who woke at all hours to bring new life into the world. What kind of man wanted that? Friday came faster than she expected. Prudence had 3 appointments that day, routine checks on pregnant mothers, but miraculously no emergencies. She had time to heat water for a proper bath, to wash her hair with the lavender soap she saved for special occasions, to press her one good dress, a deep green cotton that brought out her hazel eyes. When Augustus arrived at 6 sharp, freshly shaved and wearing clean clothes, the look on his face made all her nervous preparation worthwhile. "You're beautiful," he said simply, offering his arm. The hotel dining room was the fanciest establishment in Palisade, which meant it had real tablecloths and didn't water down the whiskey. Miners and ranchers filled most of the tables, but Augustus had somehow secured one by the window overlooking the main street. He held her chair like a gentleman, and Prudence felt something unfamiliar bloom in her chest. Hope, maybe, or possibility. "Tell me about yourself," Augustus said after they'd ordered. "How does a woman end up being the only midwife in a Colorado frontier town?" Prudence traced the rim of her water glass. "My mother was a midwife in St. Louis. She taught me everything she knew, said women needed other women who understood the mysteries of bringing life into the world. When she died 3 years ago, I couldn't stay in the city anymore. Too many memories. I heard Palisade needed a midwife, so I came west. That must have been hard, leaving everything you knew. It was. But it was also freeing. Out here, I'm not the girl whose father drank himself to death or whose brother got hanged for theft. I'm just Prudence the midwife. I built something here, a practice, a purpose. But some days..." She trailed off, unsure how much to reveal. "Some days it's lonely," Augustus finished quietly. "I know that feeling." Their eyes met across the table, and Prudence saw her own isolation reflected back at her. This man understood what it meant to be alone in a crowd, to serve others while your own needs went unmet. "Your turn," she said softly. "How does a cowboy end up in Palisade?" Augustus leaned back, his fingers playing with his fork. "I grew up in Kansas on a small farm that barely fed us. My father died when I was 15 and I left to make my way. Figured I was better with horses than crops, so I hired on with a cattle drive. Been working ranches ever since, moving from place to place, never quite finding anywhere that felt like home." "And Palisade?" Prudence asked. "Might be different." His blue eyes found hers again. "I'm 27 years old and I'm tired of drifting. The Double Creek Ranch is good land with a fair boss, and there's other reasons to stay." The weight of his gaze made her cheeks warm. Prudence wasn't used to this, to being seen as a woman rather than just a pair of skilled hands. It frightened her and thrilled her in equal measure. Their food arrived, and they ate slowly, talking about everything and nothing. Augustus told her about life on the trail, about sleeping under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, about the satisfaction of breaking a wild horse with patience instead of force. Prudence shared stories of deliveries that had gone miraculously right, of babies born in snowstorms and drought, of the fierce joy that came from placing a squalling newborn in its mother's arms. "You really love it," Augustus observed, "even though it exhausts you." "I do," Prudence admitted. "But sometimes I wonder if there's room in my life for anything else. The babies don't come on a schedule. I can't plan ahead, can't make promises about where I'll be or what I'll be doing. Any moment, someone might need me." "Sounds like ranch work," Augustus said with a slight smile. "Cows don't calve on a schedule either, and horses get colic at 3 in the morning. But good ranch hands find time for living too. Find people who understand the demands of the work." Was he saying he understood? That he might be willing to build something with a woman whose life was unpredictable and exhausting? Prudence hardly dared hope. They were finishing their coffee when the door burst open and young Tommy Bradford raced in, wild-eyed and breathing hard. "Miss Jenkins, you got to come quick. Ma's baby is coming early and something's wrong." The moment shattered. Prudence was already standing, her mind shifting from woman to midwife in an instant. She turned to Augustus with an apology forming on her lips, but he was standing too, throwing coins on the table. "I'll drive you," he said firmly. "My horse is faster." They rode hard through the twilight, Augustus's arm solid around her waist as they raced toward the Bradford homestead, 5 miles north of town. Prudence's medical bag bounced against her hip, and she tried to prepare herself mentally for whatever she'd find. Emma Bradford was only 7 months along, too early for a safe delivery. The scene inside the Bradford house was chaos. Emma hemorrhaging badly, her husband white-faced and useless with terror, 3 small children crying in the corner. Prudence took control immediately, barking orders at Augustus like she'd known him for years instead of days. "Get those children out of here. Make them hot cocoa or tell them stories. I don't care. Just keep them calm. Mr. Bradford, boil water. Mrs. Bradford, I need you to listen to my voice and breathe." Augustus gathered the frightened children without hesitation, his deep voice gentle as he herded them into the next room. Through the thin walls, Prudence could hear him telling them about a magic horse he'd once known, his tone soothing and steady. The children's sobs quieted. The next 3 hours tested every skill Prudence possessed. The baby came too fast, too small, a tiny boy who fit in her 2 hands. He wasn't breathing. Prudence worked mechanically, clearing airways, stimulating breathing, her own heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Emma was still bleeding. Prudence packed the wound with clean cloths, administered ergot to help the womb contract, pressed and massaged with steady hands while her mind screamed that she might lose them both. The baby gasped, then cried, a thin, reedy sound that was the most beautiful thing Prudence had ever heard. She wrapped him in warm blankets and handed him to Emma while she worked to stop the bleeding. When she finally stepped out of the bedroom as dawn broke, Prudence was shaking. Augustus stood immediately from where he'd been sitting with the Bradford children, all 3 now asleep in a pile on the sofa. He took one look at her face and pulled her into his arms. Prudence broke. All the fear and exhaustion and terror she'd held at bay came pouring out in wrenching sobs against his chest. Augustus held her through it, one hand stroking her hair, murmuring wordless comfort until the storm passed. "They're both alive," she finally whispered. "The baby's so small, but he's fighting. Emma's stable, they're alive. Because of you," Augustus said firmly. "You brought them back. I couldn't have done it without you. Keeping the children calm, helping Mr. Bradford stay functional. You were perfect." Augustus pulled back enough to look at her face, his thumb wiping away her tears. "We made a good team." Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition that went deeper than attraction. They fit together, this cowboy and this midwife, two lonely souls who understood the demands of difficult work and the need for someone who could stand steady in a crisis. "I should get you home," Augustus said softly. "You need rest." But when they returned to Prudence's cabin, she found two pregnant women waiting on her porch, both looking anxious. Her rest would have to wait. Augustus saw her resignation and made another decision. "I'll come back this evening with dinner, and tomorrow, and the day after. Someone needs to make sure you eat." True to his word, Augustus appeared every evening for the next week with food and quiet company. Sometimes Prudence was free to eat with him. Other times emergencies called her away, and she'd return hours later to find a warm meal waiting and a note in that rough masculine script. He never complained, never demanded her time, just showed up with steady reliability that Prudence had never experienced before. On the 8th day, she found him repairing her chicken coop fence, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular forearms. The sight of him doing domestic tasks in her space made something warm unfold in her chest. "You don't have to do that," she called from the doorway. Augustus looked up with a grin. "I know, want to anyway. Those chickens of yours nearly escaped this morning. Figured you had enough to worry about without chasing hens all over Palisade." Prudence walked over to where he worked, watching his capable hands mend the broken slats. "Why are you doing all this, Augustus? The food, the chores, the patience with my unpredictable schedule. What do you want?" He set down his hammer and turned to face her fully. "Honestly, I want to court you proper. Want to see if this thing between us is as real as it feels. But I know your life isn't easy, and I'm not trying to add pressure. I just want to help carry some of the weight." "I'm not used to anyone helping me," Prudence admitted. "I've been taking care of myself for so long, I forgot what it felt like to let someone else share the burden." Augustus stepped closer, his blue eyes intense. "Then maybe it's time to remember. You don't have to do everything alone, Prudence. You're allowed to need people too." She reached up and touched his face, feeling the rasp of afternoon stubble under her palm. "I'm starting to need you, and that terrifies me. What if you leave? What if you get tired of interrupted dinners and canceled plans and me being too exhausted to talk?" "I'm not leaving," Augustus said firmly. "And I don't get tired of things that matter. You matter, Prudence Jenkins. More than anyone I've met in all my years of drifting. I want to build something here with you if you'll let me." Prudence kissed him then, standing in her chicken yard in the middle of the afternoon, and it felt like coming home. His arms came around her, strong and sure, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt safe. Their courtship became the talk of Palisade. The reserved midwife and the new ranch hand, an unlikely pair that somehow made perfect sense. Augustus integrated himself into her life with surprising ease, learning which mothers needed checking, which patients required follow-up care. He'd drive her to distant homesteads in his wagon, wait patiently while she worked, and drive her home again through starlit nights. In June, they attended the town's summer social together, and Prudence danced for the first time in years. Augustus held her carefully, mindful of her perpetual tiredness, and waltzed her around the lantern-lit square while the whole town watched with approval. "People are talking," Prudence murmured against his shoulder. "Let them talk," Augustus replied. "I'm proud to be seen with you." Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, approached them during a break in the music. She was 6 months pregnant with her 4th child, and Prudence had been monitoring her closely due to complications with the previous pregnancy. "Miss Jenkins, I wanted to thank you for all your care," Mrs. Patterson said warmly. and to say how happy we are to see you happy. You give so much to this community. You deserve joy." After she left, Prudence blinked back tears. "I never realized people noticed me, I mean, not just what I do." "They notice," Augustus assured her. "You're loved here, Prudence. You just been too tired to see it." In July, a terrible accident at the mine sent Prudence into 3 days of round-the-clock work, treating injuries and infection. Augustus practically moved into her cabin, keeping her stocked with food and clean water, forcing her to sleep in 2-hour intervals. When it was over and all the miners were on the mend, Prudence collapsed into bed for 16 hours straight. She woke to find Augustus asleep in the chair beside her bed, his hand resting on the quilt near hers as if he'd been holding vigil. The sight of him there, stubbled and rumpled from uncomfortable sleep, watching over her even in his exhaustion, made her heart clench with love. Love. When had it become love? Maybe it had been love from the moment he caught her from falling in the street. Or maybe love had grown slowly, fed by 1,000 small kindnesses, by understanding and patience and showing up day after day without fail. Prudence reached out and touched his hand. Augustus woke instantly, his eyes finding hers with relief. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by horses," she admitted. "But better." "Augustus, you should have gone home, slept in a real bed. Didn't want to leave you alone." He stretched, his back cracking. "Besides, someone had to make sure you actually rested instead of rushing off to the next emergency." "What did I do to deserve you?" Prudence whispered. Augustus moved from the chair to sit on the edge of her bed, his hand cupping her cheek. "You were brave and strong and dedicated to helping people. You were yourself. That's all you needed to do." They married in August on a Sunday afternoon when Prudence miraculously had no pending deliveries. The ceremony was simple, held in the small church with half of Palisade in attendance. Prudence wore a dress she'd sewn herself from cream-colored cotton, and Augustus wore his best suit, looking almost uncomfortable in formal clothes. Reverend Mitchell performed the ceremony, his voice carrying across the packed church. "Do you, Augustus Irving, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health for richer or poorer as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Augustus said firmly, his blue eyes never leaving Prudence's face. "And do you, Prudence Jenkins, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" Prudence's voice came out strong and clear. "I do." When they kissed, sealing their vows, the congregation erupted in applause. Prudence laughed against Augustus's mouth, giddy with happiness and disbelief that this was real, that she got to keep him. The reception was held at the hotel and someone had brought a fiddle. They danced and ate cake and Prudence's face hurt from smiling. Mrs. Patterson waddled over, heavily pregnant now and due any day. "You look radiant," she told Prudence. "Marriage suits you." "Happiness suits me," Prudence corrected gently. "Augustus makes me happy." As if summoned by his name, Augustus appeared with 2 glasses of punch. He handed one to Prudence and nodded respectfully to Mrs. Patterson. "How are you feeling, madam? My wife mentioned you're getting close." "My wife." The words sent a thrill through Prudence. "Any day now, Mrs. Patterson confirmed. "Probably in the middle of your honeymoon, knowing my luck." Augustus just smiled. "We're not going anywhere. Prudence's work doesn't stop for a wedding." True to prediction, Mrs. Patterson went into labor 2 days later. Prudence arrived at the Patterson house to find Augustus already there, having driven over with supplies when the messenger came. He'd organized the household, kept the other children calm, and had hot water ready. The delivery was smooth and quick. a healthy baby girl who came into the world howling with indignation. When Prudence placed the baby in Mrs. Patterson's arms, she looked up to find Augustus watching her with such love and pride that it took her breath away. This was her life now. Not lonely anymore, but shared with a man who understood her calling and supported it without resentment. A partner in every sense of the word. They settled into married life with surprising ease. Augustus had moved into Prudence's cabin, bringing his few possessions and immediately making the space more livable. He built shelves for her medical supplies, repaired the roof, expanded the chicken coop. In the evenings when Prudence wasn't working, they'd sit on the porch and watch the sunset paint the mountains, his arm around her shoulders, her head on his chest. "Tell me about your day," became their ritual. Augustus would share stories from the ranch, about ornery cattle and wild horses, and Prudence would talk about the mothers she'd visited and the babies she'd checked. Their lives intertwined like the roots of two trees planted close together, separate but connected, each making the other stronger. In October, Prudence realized her monthly courses were late. She waited another week to be sure, then another, her heart pounding with a mixture of joy and fear. Finally, she told Augustus one evening as they prepared for bed. "I'm pregnant," she said simply, watching his face in the lamplight. Augustus froze, his shirt half unbuttoned, his expression stunned. Then the biggest smile she'd ever seen spread across his face. "We're having a baby, really, really." Prudence laughed as he swept her into his arms, spinning her around the small bedroom. "Careful, I'm still fragile." "You're the strongest person I know," Augustus said, setting her down gently. Then his expression grew serious. "But you need to take better care of yourself now. No more running yourself into the ground. We need to find you help." Prudence had been thinking the same thing. "There's a woman in Grand Junction, trained as a nurse. I heard she might be looking for work. If we could convince her to come to Palisade, she could assist me with deliveries and take over the simpler cases." "Then I'll ride to Grand Junction tomorrow," Augustus said firmly. "Whatever it takes to keep you and our baby healthy." The woman's name was Sarah Mitchell, and she proved to be a godsend. Young and energetic at 22, with genuine compassion and quick learning skills, she took to midwifery like she'd been born for it. Prudence trained her carefully, and within 2 months, Sarah was handling routine deliveries on her own. For the first time since coming to Palisade, Prudence had time to breathe, time to rest, time to nurture the life growing inside her while still serving her community. Augustus watched her like a hawk, making sure she ate properly and slept enough, but his protectiveness came from love rather than control. Winter arrived, blanketing Palisade in snow. Prudence's belly swelled with the baby, and she found herself on the receiving end of care rather than giving it. The women she'd helped through their pregnancies brought her food and advice, checked on her with genuine concern. Augustus hovered, building up the fire, rubbing her feet when they swelled, reading to her from the newspaper in the evenings. "Are you scared?" he asked one night in January, his hand resting on her rounded stomach. "Terrified," Prudence admitted. "I've delivered so many babies, seen everything that can go wrong, but I'm also excited. This is ours, Augustus, a life we created together." Their son was born on a cold February morning in 1886, delivered by Sarah Mitchell while Augustus held Prudence's hand and whispered encouragement. The labor was long but uncomplicated, and when the baby finally arrived, his lusty cry filled the cabin. "A boy," Sarah announced, placing the squirming infant on Prudence's chest. "Healthy and strong." Prudence looked down at her son, at his red face and dark hair, and felt love unlike anything she'd ever experienced. Augustus leaned over them both, his eyes wet with tears he didn't bother hiding. "He's perfect," Augustus breathed. "You're both perfect." They named him James after Augustus's father, and he became the center of their universe. Augustus proved to be a devoted father, rising in the night to bring the baby to Prudence for feeding, changing diapers without complaint, walking the floor when James was fussy. Prudence watched her husband cradle their son and fell in love with him all over again. Spring came, and with it, a new rhythm to their lives. Prudence returned to work part-time, taking only the complicated cases while Sarah handled the rest. Augustus had been promoted to foreman at the Double Creek Ranch, a position that came with better pay and more respect. They were building something real, something lasting. On a warm April evening, almost exactly a year after they'd first met, Prudence and Augustus sat on their porch watching the sunset. James slept in his cradle nearby, one tiny fist curled against his cheek. The mountains glowed purple and gold in the fading light, and the air smelled of sage and possibility. "You remember the night we met?" Prudence asked softly. "When you nearly ran me over with your horse," Augustus chuckled. "How could I forget? You looked half dead on your feet, and all I could think was that someone needed to take care of you." "You've been taking care of me ever since," Prudence said, turning to look at him. "And I never properly thanked you, for seeing me when I was invisible, for staying when my life was chaos, for loving me even when I was too exhausted to love myself." Augustus pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You saved me too, you know. I was drifting, looking for something I couldn't name. Turns out I was looking for home, for you, for this." He gestured to encompass their life. The cabin they'd improved together, the baby they'd created, the community they served, the future stretching bright before them. "I was so lonely," Prudence whispered. "So tired and lonely, delivering all those babies and going home to an empty house. I thought that was just my life, that I'd chosen solitude when I chose this work." "You didn't have to choose," Augustus said firmly. "You just needed the right person, someone who understood that your calling doesn't diminish what we have. It's part of who you are, and I love all of you." James stirred in his cradle, making the small snuffling sounds that meant he'd wake soon and want feeding. Prudence rose to get him, but Augustus stopped her with a gentle hand. "Let me," he said, scooping up their son. James settled immediately against his father's chest, tiny hand gripping Augustus's shirt. "See, he knows his papa." Prudence watched them together, her heart so full it ached. This was everything she'd never dared to dream about. Love and partnership, understanding and support, a family built on mutual respect and genuine affection. The years that followed brought challenges and joys in equal measure. Prudence and Sarah built a thriving midwifery practice, earning respect throughout the region. Augustus became part owner of the Double Creek Ranch, his hard work and integrity rewarded with opportunity. James grew strong and healthy, a curious boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determination. In 1888, they welcomed a daughter they named Caroline, delivered by Sarah while Prudence gripped Augustus's hand and marveled at experiencing childbirth from the other side. Caroline was a placid baby, content to watch the world with solemn gray eyes, so different from her energetic brother. The cabin expanded to accommodate their growing family. Augustus built an addition with 2 bedrooms and a proper surgery room for Prudence's medical work. They planted fruit trees and a garden, raised chickens and a milk cow, created a homestead that felt permanent and real. Palisade grew too, transforming from a rough frontier town into a proper community. The railroad came through in 1890, bringing easier access to supplies and medicines. Prudence ordered medical textbooks from back east, constantly updating her knowledge and skills. She taught Sarah everything she learned, creating a legacy that would outlast her. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Augustus surprised Prudence with a trip to Grand Junction, their first time away from Palisade together since their wedding. Sarah agreed to watch James and Caroline, and they spent 2 glorious days in a hotel, sleeping late and eating meals they didn't have to cook. "I can't remember the last time we had a whole night alone," Prudence said, curled against Augustus in the hotel bed. "No babies crying, no emergencies, just us." "We should do this more often," Augustus murmured, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "Take time for ourselves." "I'd like that," Prudence agreed, "though I miss them already." James with his endless questions and Caroline with her serious little face. Augustus laughed. "We're terrible. Can't even enjoy 2 days without our children before we start missing them." But it was true. Their life in Palisade, chaotic and demanding as it could be, was exactly where they wanted to be. Together, they'd built something beautiful from loneliness and exhaustion, transforming isolation into connection, weariness into purpose. The children grew. James at 7 was already helping Augustus with ranch work, learning to ride and rope with the same dedication his father brought to everything. Caroline at 5 had discovered her mother's medical books and spent hours studying the illustrations, asking questions that showed a keen and curious mind. "I think Caroline might follow in your footsteps," Augustus observed one evening, watching their daughter carefully bandage her doll's arm with scraps of cloth. "I hope she chooses it because she loves it," Prudence said. "Not because she thinks she should. Medicine is rewarding but brutal." "I want her to have options." "She'll have options," Augustus assured her. "Both of them will. We're making sure of that." They were. Augustus had been saving money for years, putting aside funds for the children's education. Prudence took on paying students, training young women in midwifery and nursing, building a network of skilled practitioners across Colorado. They were investing in the future, not just their own but their communities. In 1893, Prudence turned 32 and realized with some shock that she'd spent 8 years in Palisade. 8 years that had transformed her from an exhausted, lonely midwife into a wife, mother, teacher, and pillar of the community. She'd delivered over 200 babies now, including a set of triplets that had nearly sent her into early retirement. She'd trained 5 nurses and 3 midwives. She'd saved lives and lost some too, each one leaving its mark on her heart, but she wasn't lonely anymore. That was the difference Augustus had made, the gift he'd given her that night he'd caught her in the street and refused to let her fall. He'd shown her that she could be both dedicated to her calling and open to love, that the two weren't mutually exclusive. "What are you thinking about?" Augustus asked, finding her on the porch in the twilight. The children were asleep and the house was quiet. "How different my life is from what I imagined," Prudence said. "When I came to Palisade, I thought I'd spend my life alone, married to my work. I'd accepted that." Augustus settled beside her, pulling her into the circle of his arm. "And now I can't imagine life without you, without them." She gestured toward the house where their children slept. "You delivered me from loneliness, Augustus. You saved me as surely as I've saved any of those mothers and babies." "We saved each other," Augustus corrected gently. "I was just as lost before I met you, just as lonely, drifting from place to place with no anchor. You gave me purpose, gave me home." They sat in comfortable silence, watching stars appear in the darkening sky. The mountains rose black against the purple twilight, eternal and unchanging, witnesses to all the small human dramas playing out in their shadow. "You ever miss it?" Prudence asked suddenly. The drifting, the freedom, not being tied down to a family, Augustus considered the question seriously. Sometimes I miss the simplicity of those days, just me and a horse and the open trail, but I don't miss the emptiness. Every place I went, I was searching for something. Took meeting you to realize I was searching for this, for someone to build a life with. Prudence turned to kiss him, tasting coffee and contentment on his lips. After 8 years of marriage, the passion between them had mellowed into something deeper and more sustaining. Not the wild rush of new love, but the steady warmth of partnership and genuine affection. "I love you," she said simply. "Thank you for being patient with my work, with the interrupted nights and canceled plans." "Your work is part of who you are," Augustus replied. "I knew that from the beginning. Besides, we've had plenty of good nights and kept plenty of plans. The interrupted ones just make us appreciate the peaceful ones more." It was true. They'd learned to steal moments of connection whenever they could. Early morning coffee before the day's demands began, quiet conversations while preparing dinner together, stolen kisses when the children were occupied. Their love had adapted to the realities of their lives, becoming flexible and resilient. In 1895, tragedy struck when an influenza outbreak swept through Palisade. Prudence and Sarah worked around the clock, tending to the sick and dying, but the disease was merciless. They lost 12 people, including 2 children. Prudence had delivered herself. She came home each night devastated, and Augustus held her through the grief, absorbing her tears without trying to fix what couldn't be fixed. When the outbreak finally passed, Prudence was hollow with exhaustion and sorrow. She sat at her kitchen table staring at nothing while Augustus made her tea she didn't drink. "I couldn't save them," she whispered. "All my training, all my experience, and I watched them die anyway." Augustus knelt beside her chair, taking her cold hands in his. "You did everything humanly possible. Sometimes the disease wins. That doesn't mean you failed. Then why does it feel like failure? Because you care. Because every life matters to you." Augustus pressed her hands to his heart. "That compassion is what makes you good at what you do, but it also means you feel the losses deeply. Let yourself grieve, Prudence. You don't have to be strong all the time." So she grieved, and Augustus stood steady beside her, a rock in the storm of her sorrow. When she was ready, he helped her find her way back to purpose, reminded her of all the lives she had saved, all the mothers and babies who thrived because of her skill. The town held a memorial service for those lost to the influenza. Reverend Mitchell spoke of God's mysterious ways, but afterward, Mrs. Patterson approached Prudence with tears in her eyes. "Don't you dare blame yourself," she said fiercely. "You and Sarah saved my youngest when she fell ill. You've saved half this town at one point or another. We know you did everything you could." The community's support helped heal the wounds the outbreak had left. Prudence returned to work slowly, taking easier cases while Sarah handled the more demanding ones. Augustus watched over her carefully, making sure she didn't push herself too hard too fast. James was 11 now, and Caroline 9, old enough to understand that their mother had been sick at heart if not in body. They were gentle with her, bringing her wildflowers and drawings, offering wordless comfort in the way of children who know something is wrong but don't fully understand what. "Your mother is the bravest person I know," Augustus told them one evening. "She fights death every day, and sometimes she wins and sometimes she doesn't. But she never stops fighting. That's real courage." By summer, Prudence had found her footing again. The grief was still there, probably always would be, but she'd learned to carry it alongside the joy of successful deliveries and healthy patients. Life continued, demanding and beautiful and utterly unpredictable. In 1897, Caroline announced at 13 that she wanted to study medicine formally, not just midwifery but surgery and anatomy and all the sciences. Prudence's heart swelled with pride and trepidation. Medical school is difficult, she cautioned, especially for women. You'll face prejudice and obstacles I can't even imagine. I know, Caroline said, her gray eyes steady and determined. But you taught me that important work is worth fighting for. If you can bring life into the world under impossible conditions, I can handle whatever medical school throws at me. Augustus smiled from his chair by the fire. She's got your stubbornness and your determination, Prudence replied. God help us all. They began saving for Caroline's education in earnest, putting aside every spare penny. James, now 15, had decided ranch work was his calling and had started hiring on with Augustus at the Double Creek. Watching her children grow into capable, compassionate young adults filled Prudence with a satisfaction that rivaled her professional accomplishments. We did good, Augustus said one night, watching James teach Caroline to rope fence posts in the yard. They're turning out all right. Better than all right, Prudence agreed. They're extraordinary, and they have you to thank for that. You've been such a good father, Augustus. Patient and present, teaching them by example. Learned from the best, Augustus said, pulling her close. You show them every day what it means to serve others, to work hard, to care deeply. I just follow your lead. In 1899, Prudence turned 38 and realized she'd spent 14 years in Palisade. The town had changed dramatically, growing from a rough frontier settlement into a proper community with schools and churches, a library and a hospital. The hospital's establishment had been bittersweet for Prudence. On one hand, it meant better facilities and resources for her patients. On the other, it represented the slow decline of the traditional midwife's role, but Prudence adapted. She joined the hospital's staff as a consultant, teaching young doctors about childbirth and women's health, advocating for her patients with the authority of decades of experience. Sarah ran the midwifery practice, taking on students of her own, creating a legacy that would outlive them both. Augustus, now 41, had become one of the most respected ranchers in the region. The Double Creek Ranch thrived under his management, and he'd invested in several other business ventures around Palisade. They were comfortable now, not wealthy but secure, able to give their children opportunities neither of them had enjoyed. The new century arrived with celebration and optimism. Palisade threw a party that lasted 3 days, and Prudence and Augustus danced in the town square just as they had 15 years earlier, older now but no less in love. A new century, Prudence mused, watching fireworks explode over the mountains. I wonder what it will bring. Whatever it brings, we'll face it together, Augustus said firmly. That's all that matters. In 1901, Caroline left for medical school in Denver, the first woman from Palisade to pursue such an ambitious education. Prudence cried as she waved goodbye to the stagecoach, pride and worry warring in her chest. She'll be fine, Augustus assured her, his arm around her shoulders. She's strong like her mother. James, now 19, had taken over much of the day-to-day operations at the Double Creek Ranch, proving himself a natural leader and skilled cattleman. He'd started courting the schoolteacher's daughter, a sweet girl named Margaret, and Augustus teased him mercilessly about being smitten. The house felt empty with both children gone pursuing their futures, but Prudence and Augustus rediscovered the quiet joy of being just the two of them again. They took long rides into the mountains, picnicked by the river, spent lazy Sundays reading together on the porch. This is nice, Prudence said one golden autumn afternoon. I love our children desperately, but there's something peaceful about just us. Agreed, Augustus replied, looking up from his newspaper, though I suspect that peace won't last. James will marry Margaret soon, and then we'll have grandchildren underfoot. The prediction proved accurate. James married Margaret in the spring of 1902, and by winter, they announced they were expecting. Prudence found herself in the strange position of being grandmother to a baby she'd likely helped deliver. "It's the circle completing itself," Sarah observed when Prudence mentioned the odd feeling. "You've been delivering Palisades babies for 17 years. Of course you'd eventually deliver your own grandchild." When Margaret went into labor on a cold January night in 1903, Prudence found herself more nervous than she'd been for any delivery in years. This was her son's child, her grandchild, and the stakes felt impossibly high. Augustus drove her to James's house, then stayed to pace with his son while Prudence and Sarah tended to Margaret. The delivery was textbook perfect, a healthy baby boy who arrived with minimal fuss and maximum volume. "You have a grandson," Prudence told James, placing the baby in his arms. Her son's face transformed with wonder and terror and overwhelming love, and Prudence saw herself reflected in his expression. Remembered the day she'd first held him and felt that same complex mix of emotions. They named the baby Thomas Augustus Irving, and he became the center of the family's universe. Prudence had thought she couldn't love anyone more than she loved her own children, but grandmotherhood proved her wrong. Little Thomas wrapped himself around her heart, and she spoiled him shamelessly. "You're going to ruin that boy," Augustus teased, watching Prudence rock the baby while Margaret napped. "That's what grandmothers do," Prudence replied serenely. "We get all the fun and none of the sleepless nights." Caroline came home for the summer of 1903, transformed by her medical education but still fundamentally their daughter. She examined baby Thomas with professional interest, asked Prudence detailed questions about the delivery, and announced her intention to specialize in obstetrics. "I want to do what you do," she told her mother, "but with the resources and knowledge of modern medicine. Combine the traditional wisdom of midwifery with surgical techniques and scientific understanding." Prudence felt pride surge through her. Her daughter was taking the work she loved and elevating it, bringing it into the new century with respect for the old ways and enthusiasm for the new. That evening, the whole family gathered for dinner. Prudence and Augustus, James and Margaret with baby Thomas, Caroline home from school. They crowded around the expanded dining table, passing bowls of food and sharing stories, laughter rising to the rafters. Augustus caught Prudence's eye across the table and smiled, and she knew he was thinking the same thing she was. This life they'd built, this family they'd created, started with a chance meeting on a dusty street 17 years ago. Started with exhaustion and loneliness meeting compassion and steadiness. After dinner, when the children had left and the house was quiet, Prudence and Augustus sat on their porch in the twilight. This porch where they'd spent countless evenings, where they'd dreamed and planned and simply existed together. "You remember when I asked you to dinner?" Augustus said softly. "That first time when you looked so shocked that anyone wanted to take care of you." "I remember," Prudence replied. "I thought you were crazy, wanting to court the exhausted midwife who smelled like carbolic soap." "I thought you were the bravest person I'd ever met," Augustus countered. "Still do. Watching you work, seeing how you give everything to help others, it humbles me every day." Prudence leaned into his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him, leather and hay and home. "I was drowning in loneliness before you came along, going through the motions of living but not really alive. You changed everything." "We changed everything," Augustus corrected. "Together. That's how it works, Prudence. We each brought something the other needed, and we built this life piece by piece." It was true. Their love story hadn't been dramatic or sweeping, no grand gestures or passionate declarations. Instead, It had been built from 1,000 small moments. Meals shared and chores divided, hands held during difficult deliveries, quiet support through grief and celebration. Ordinary moments that added up to an extraordinary life. In 1905, Caroline graduated from medical school, one of only 3 women in her class. The whole family traveled to Denver for the ceremony, and Prudence wept openly as her daughter received her diploma. Dr. Caroline Irving, the first female physician from Palisade, Colorado. Caroline returned home and joined the hospital staff, specializing in obstetrics, just as she'd planned. She and Prudence worked together frequently, combining the midwife's practical experience with the doctor's medical knowledge. They made a formidable team, and the maternal mortality rate in Palisade dropped to nearly nothing under their combined care. James and Margaret welcomed a daughter in 1906, naming her Prudence after her grandmother. Holding her namesake, Prudence felt the years settle on her shoulders with surprising weight. She was 45 now, and while still active and healthy, she felt the first whispers of age. "I'm getting old," she told Augustus that night. "We both are," he agreed. He was 48, his dark hair shot through with silver, lines deepening around his eyes. But he was still strong, still steady, still the man who'd caught her from falling 2 decades ago. That's not a bad thing. Means we've lived well, built something lasting. Prudence traced the lines on his face, each one a map of the life they'd shared. "I don't regret a single day. Not one. Even the hard ones, the losses and the grief. It all led here to this moment, to this life with you." "No regrets here either," Augustus said, pulling her close. "Best decision I ever made was staying in Palisade. Second best was convincing you to let me court you." They celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary in 1908 with a party attended by half the town. Prudence looked around at the familiar faces, people she'd helped bring into the world and people whose children she'd delivered, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. This community had been her life's work, and they'd given her so much in return. Sarah, now 42 and still running the midwifery practice, raised a glass in toast. "To Prudence and Augustus Irving, who showed us all what real partnership looks like. May you have 20 more years of happiness." "Hear, hear." The room erupted in agreement. Later, dancing with Augustus while a local band played, Prudence reflected on how far they'd come. From that first awkward dinner interrupted by an emergency to this, surrounded by family and friends and the life they'd built together. "What are you thinking?" Augustus asked, always attuned to her moods. "That I'm the luckiest woman alive," Prudence said honestly. "I have meaningful work that I love, children who have become extraordinary adults, grandchildren who make my heart sing, and you. Always you, Augustus, standing steady beside me through everything." "The luck was mine," Augustus replied. "Finding you, loving you, building this life. I was just a drifting cowboy before you. You gave me purpose, gave me home." "We gave each other home," Prudence corrected, echoing his words from years before. "That's what love does. It creates a place to belong." The years continued their steady march. Prudence gradually retired from active practice, training younger midwives and consulting on difficult cases, while Caroline took over most of the deliveries. Augustus, now in his 50s, still ran the Double Creek Ranch but had started teaching James the business side, preparing to eventually hand over full control. They were becoming elders of the community, their love story part of Palisade's history. Young couples sought their advice, wanting to know the secret to a lasting marriage. "There's no secret," Prudence would tell them. "Just show up. Every day choose to love each other, support each other's dreams, share the burdens and the joys, be partners in the truest sense." In 1912, on a crisp October evening, Prudence and Augustus celebrated their 56th and 54th birthdays, respectively. The grandchildren, now numbering 4 with James and Margaret's additions, ran wild through the house while the adults tried to maintain order. "We're too old for this chaos," Augustus joked, rescuing a lamp from little Prudence's enthusiastic play. "Speak for yourself," Prudence replied, though she was breathless from chasing Thomas. "I feel young as ever." That night, after the family had gone home and the house was quiet, they returned to their porch. This porch that had been witness to so much of their life together, conversations and dreams and simple, companionable silence. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't nearly run you over that day?" Augustus asked. Prudence considered. "I suppose I would have continued as I was, working myself to exhaustion, living a half-life dedicated entirely to others with nothing for myself. Eventually, I might have burned out completely or grown bitter, or maybe I would have been fine, found contentment in my work alone. But you're glad I did. Nearly run you over, gladder than I can possibly express," Prudence said, taking his hand. "You saw me when I was invisible. You cared for me when I'd forgotten how to care for myself. You showed me that I could have both my calling and a rich personal life, that the two weren't mutually exclusive. You delivered me from loneliness, Augustus, and gave me more than I ever dreamed possible." Augustus raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "The delivering went both ways. I was lost before you, Prudence, drifting through life with no anchor, no purpose beyond the next job. You gave me a reason to stay, to build, to become more than I was." They sat in the darkness, holding hands, while stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance. 24 years of marriage, 27 years since they'd first met, and the love between them had only deepened with time. It had weathered storms and celebrated joys, bent but never broken, growing stronger with each passing year. "I love you," Prudence whispered into the night. "I loved you when I was too exhausted to know what love was. I loved you when I was learning to be a wife and mother. I love you now, with all the weight of years and experience behind us. My love for you is the constant in my life, the foundation everything else is built on." "And I love you," Augustus replied, his voice rough with emotion. "From that first moment I saw you stumbling through the street, I knew you were someone special, someone worth staying for. I've never regretted that decision, not for a single day. You're my heart, Prudence, my home, my everything." They kissed in the starlight, two people who'd found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from loneliness and chance. Their love story might not be dramatic or sweeping, but it was real and deep and lasting, the kind of love that sustains through hardship and celebrates the small joys of daily life. The years ahead would bring changes, as years always do. Eventually, they would slow down fully, hand over their work to the next generation, become the elderly couple on the porch that young people waved to as they passed. Eventually, one would leave before the other, and the survivor would grieve deeply but not regret the love they'd shared. But that was the future, distant and uncertain. For now, they had this moment, this evening, this life they'd built together. They had each other, and that was everything. As they rose to go inside, Augustus paused to look at his wife in the lamplight streaming from the windows. She was 51 now, her dark hair liberally streaked with silver, lines etched around her eyes and mouth from years of smiling and worrying and caring deeply about everything she did. She was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "What?" Prudence asked, catching his stare. "Just memorizing this moment," Augustus said. "You, here now, the life we've built. I want to remember every detail." Prudence smiled, the expression lighting her entire face. "Come inside, you sentimental fool. I'll make us tea and you can tell me about this new horse James is so excited about." They walked inside together, his arm around her waist, her head on his shoulder, moving in the easy synchronization of people who'd walked side by side for decades. The door closed behind them, shutting out the night, enclosing them in the warmth and light of the home they'd created. Their love story, born from exhaustion and loneliness, had bloomed into something neither could have imagined that dusty day in 1885. The midwife who'd been too tired to see her own needs, and the cowboy who'd recognized them anyway, had found in each other exactly what they'd been missing. Together, they'd built a life of purpose and partnership, of love and service, of family and community, and it was more than enough. It was everything. The end came peacefully for both of them, though not for many years yet. They lived long lives filled with grandchildren and great-grandchildren, watching Palisade transform from a frontier town into a modern community, seeing the old century fade and the new one establish itself firmly. They aged together, growing slower but not less devoted, their love the one constant in a changing world. When Augustus passed in his sleep at 72, Prudence grieved deeply, but without regret. They'd had 36 years of marriage, 40 years of knowing each other, and every moment had been a gift. She lived 3 more years, long enough to see Caroline become chief of obstetrics at the hospital, long enough to hold her first great-great-grandchild, long enough to know that the legacy she and Augustus had built would continue long after they were gone. She died quietly one spring morning, sitting in the chair on the porch where they'd spent so many evenings together. The family found her there, a peaceful expression on her face, her hand resting on the arm of Augustus's empty chair as if even in death she reached for him. They buried her beside him in the Palisade Cemetery, under the mountains they'd both loved. The whole town attended the funeral, 3 generations of people whose lives she'd touched, babies she'd delivered now grown with children and grandchildren of their own. Caroline gave the eulogy, speaking of her mother's dedication and skill, her compassion and strength, but also of the love story that had sustained her through decades of demanding work. "My mother taught me that we don't have to choose between our calling and our personal lives," Caroline said, her voice carrying across the assembled mourners. "She showed me that with the right partner, we can have both." My father understood her dedication to her work and supported it without resentment. He took care of her so she could take care of others. That partnership, that love, was the foundation of everything else she accomplished. It was a fitting epitaph for a life well lived, for a love story that had transformed 2 lonely souls into partners, parents, pillars of their community. The cowboy and the midwife, who'd found in each other exactly what they needed and built from it something lasting and beautiful. Their story became part of Palisade's history, told and retold through generations. Young midwives training at the hospital heard about Prudence Jenkins Irving and her dedication to mothers and babies. Young cowboys working the ranches heard about Augustus Irving and his integrity and skill. And young couples heard about both of them, about a love built on mutual respect and support, about partnership in its truest form. The cabin they'd shared, expanded and improved over the years, remained in the family for generations. The porch where they'd spent countless evenings became almost sacred ground, a place where their descendants would sit and feel the echo of that great love, the sense that some bonds transcend even death, and perhaps they do. Perhaps somewhere in the realm beyond this life, a cowboy and a midwife walk together still, his arm around her waist, her head on his shoulder, moving in perfect synchronization through eternity. Perhaps they sit on a porch under eternal stars, holding hands and remembering the life they built together from loneliness and chance. Or perhaps their legacy is simpler and more profound than that. Perhaps they live on in the lives they touched, the children they raised, the community they served. In every baby delivered safely, in every act of compassion and care, in every partnership built on mutual respect and genuine love, Prudence and Augustus Irving continue to influence the world. Their story was not one of dramatic passion or sweeping romance, though they had their share of both. Instead, it was a story of showing up, day after day, choosing to love and support each other through the mundane struggles and the extraordinary joys of life. It was a story of two imperfect people who found in each other exactly what they needed and built from it, something perfect in its own way. The exhausted midwife found rest in the cowboy's steady presence. The lonely cowboy found home in the midwife's fierce heart. Together, they created a life richer than either could have imagined alone, a love that sustained them through decades of joy and sorrow, a legacy that would outlive them both. And in the end, that is perhaps the greatest love story of all. Not the one that burns bright and fast, but the one that glows steadily through the years, warming everyone it touches, creating light that continues long after the original source has faded. That was Prudence and Augustus, the midwife and the cowboy, whose love delivered them both from loneliness and gave the world a beautiful example of what partnership truly means. Their grave markers stand side by side in the Palisade Cemetery, weathered now by decades of sun and snow, but the inscription remains clear. Prudence Jenkins Irving, beloved wife, mother and healer, and Augustus Irving, beloved husband, father, and friend. But to those who knew them, who heard their story, who benefited from their love and service, they were so much more than those simple words could convey. They were proof that loneliness doesn't have to be permanent, that exhaustion can be eased by the right person's care, that love can flourish even in the hardest soil if tended with patience and dedication. They were an example of what it means to truly partner with someone, to support without smothering, to care without controlling, to love without demanding. And they were, above all else, two souls who found each other in the chaos of frontier life and held on tight, building something beautiful and lasting from the simplest of foundations. Mutual respect, genuine affection, and the daily choice to stay, to love, to be present for each other no matter what challenges arose. That is their legacy. That is their story. And it continues still, whispered in the wind that blows through the Palisade Valley, visible in the sunset that paints the mountains gold, present in every act of love and service performed in their honor. The midwife was exhausted from delivering babies. The cowboy delivered her from loneliness. Together, they delivered each other into a love that transcended time and circumstance, creating something eternal from the most temporary of moments. And so their story ends where it began, with two people meeting by chance, recognizing in each other something essential, and choosing to build a life together despite the obstacles. It is a simple story in many ways, the kind that plays out in small towns and big cities every day. But it is also profound, a reminder that love doesn't have to be complicated to be deep, doesn't have to be dramatic to be meaningful, doesn't have to be perfect enough. Prudence and Augustus Irving loved each other well. They lived fully. They served generously. And when they died, they left behind a legacy of love that continues to inspire all who hear their story. In the end, that is all any of us can hope for. To love and be loved, to build something meaningful, to leave the world a little better than we found it. They did all that and more, the exhausted midwife and the steady cowboy who found in each other exactly what they needed. Their story is complete now, their lives fully lived, their love triumphant over loneliness and exhaustion and all the challenges frontier life could throw at them. And somewhere, perhaps, they rest together still, content in the knowledge that they loved well and lived fully, partners until the very end and beyond.